Everyone, can we find our seats again, please? Before I continue, is this speed okay? Am I going too fast?
No.
Right, am I going too slow?
No.
Right. Good, thank you. I'll do my best to make it generally accessible. If you have any questions, again, ask them. Are there any urgent questions right now that you want me to answer? There will be some time at the end as well. No urgent questions. Okay, we'll go to the end, that's fine. We were talking about assessing the quality of journals. And one of the main metrics that people use these days to assess journal quality are numbers. Everything has to be quantified somehow. So citation metrics serve as a measure of a journal, an article, an author, or an institution's research impact based on citations. And there are a number of very frequently used citation metrics. Some of those will be very familiar to you, including the journal impact factor, eigenfactor, 5-year impact factor, and the immediacy index. We'll talk about some of those. Now, these are numbers that in essence tell you something about the journal as a whole over the period of a year or more. They do not usually tell you much about individual papers in the journal. And that's particularly a problem with the journal impact factor. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So, all journal metrics have some inadequacies. And so, if you want to use them, you need to understand what they're based on and how they should be used. So let's have a quick look at the journal impact factor. The journal impact factor is an official quantification of the impact of journals published by, used to be published by a company called Thomson Reuters, but that has now been, the journal impact factor has now been sold to another company called Clarivate Analytics since last year, I believe. The impact factor reflects the average number of citations to recent articles published in that year. So here's how that works. You count out the number of times articles published in, let's say, 2014 and 2015 were cited by journals in 2015. So in the current year, so again, if you look at the current time in 2016, that was last year, you looked at all citations in 2015 and 2016 in journals indexed in 2016. So that's the number of citations. We then have the number of citable items, so that's the number of papers published in 2014 and 2015, and the ratio of the two is the impact factor. Now, numbers that we talk about for the highest impact factor journals, for instance, Nature has an impact factor of about 45 or something like that, 41, so it's quite high. I believe there's a journal with an even higher impact factor, and that's called the New England Journal of Medicine, which is somewhere in the 60s. So these are very high impact factors. Science is somewhere in the 30s, but most subject-specific specialized journals have much lower impact factors. And the impact factor depends on the field. In some fields, in biology, you have very high impact factors compared to, for instance, computer science. In my field, in astrophysics, most of the main journals in my field have impact factors between 4 and 6, and that's good. If you look at some other journals, some of the second and third tier journals in the field, they might have impact factors of 1.5. So that's not so good. However, if you go to the fields like computer science, journals with impact factors of 1.2 or 1.3 are considered reasonably good because of the citation behavior of researchers in those fields. It depends on the field. So be careful. Impact factors vary greatly across discipline, and new journals generally do not even have one for a certain time period. In my field again, since this year, there is a new spin-off journal of Nature called Nature Astronomy. I published an article in it earlier this year. I was asked to write what's called a news and views article. That will not get any impact factor for the next 2 years. Simply based on the definition, you need citations for the 2 years prior to getting the impact factor. Impact factors can unfortunately be artificially enhanced by journals. Some unscrupulous journal editors will ask their authors to cite more papers published in that particular journal in the past 2 years. That's actually unethical. And if you're asked to do so by an editor, I would worry if that were to happen. Because it's not ethical. So impact factors are, people don't like them, right? Because initially they were meant to give an indication of which journals had high impact, but these days university administrators are using them to check if you're a good researcher. But that doesn't make much sense, right? If I publish, let's go for Nature again. If I publish a letter in Nature, Nature has an impact factor of 44 or 45. It doesn't mean that my letter will be cited that much. It might be an absolutely poor piece of research. But because of the journal, it gets a higher standing. But it might be bad research. So these metrics only apply to the journal as a whole and not to individual articles. There's another one that's often used. It's called the eigenfactor. It's based on weighted citations. Weighted according to the prestige of the journal. So again, that is a bit of a convoluted hybrid method because you need to have a quantification for the prestige of the journal as well, which can be gamed. You don't use self-citations, so that's citations to the journal itself. So it's more difficult to game the system that way. The website does not list journals that publish fewer than 12 articles per year, average over 5 years, so these are very small journals, of course. And if a journal has an eigenfactor score of 1, it has 1% of the total influence of all index publications. And again, going to Nature as an example, Nature had the highest eigenfactor score a few years ago with a value of 1.6. So that gives you kind of a relative ranking. 1.6 is very high. Most journals have much, much lower values. There is a service out there called the Journal Citation, JCR, Journal Citation Reports, now published by Clarivate Analytics, which used to be Thomson Reuters. This is a service that can be accessed usually from universities that subscribe to this service. I tried to access it yesterday for my hotel, and I was told I need some credentials, some login credentials. So you need to be at the university that subscribes to this service. And then you can look for the journal profile, journal categories, highest ranked categories, and you can rank journals. So that might be useful in terms of you deciding where you want to publish your paper if you want to get that promotion to the next level of your academic career. So finally, peer review is the gold standard to assess the quality of submissions. So what happens? When I get a submission to my journal, I first look at the article myself because I'm a practicing scientist. So I have an idea of the potential impact of this paper in the field. I look, our journal is a rapid publication journal, so it needs to be novel, it needs to be urgent so that people can do follow-up work, and so those are the main criteria. So I look for the novelty and the urgency in the work, whether it's exciting, and whether it's not just an incremental bit of research. The Publications Board of the American Astronomical Society has asked us editors to limit the number of papers that we allow to peer review. A number of years ago, we accepted 80% of submissions, and that's way too high. That actually made us into a little bit of a laughing stock. The Publications Board wants this to go down to roughly 40%. So that means that roughly 2 out of every 3 submissions have to be rejected at some point. A rejection can be a desk rejection. Me looking at it and saying, this is not so urgent, this is not very novel. Please go to our main journal instead of a letters journal. That's a desk rejection. It can be rejected after a peer reviewer says, well, this is not so urgent, not so novel, move it to a regular journal. Or it can be because the reviewers ask for much more work to be done, which then makes the article become too long to still qualify for a short, rapid publication. And then it also has to be moved to the main journal. So these are what we call rejections in my journal. Peer review is the process where the editor then decides it's not a desk rejection, I send it off to one or more practicing scientists in the field who have a track record that makes them qualified to assess whether your submission meets minimum standards. The minimum standards vary across fields, of course. And so you submit your, so the editor sends that particular, your paper to one or more reviewers. Again, the number depends on the field and the journal. And these reviewers then look at it and they provide you with comments. We'll talk about responding to reviewers' reports this afternoon in the second part of the workshop. The reviewers tend to be very critical. So the first time you get a bunch of referees' reports, you might be shocked by the fact that the reviewer didn't like your work. At least that's what it looks like. But most of the time the reviewer will just be critical and objective. Saying, oh, this is not good enough, but it could be improved by doing the following. That's not a personal assessment of you. The reviewer doesn't know you. So how can it be personal? Right? Sometimes there are exceptions, of course. But so you respond to the peer review and then you resubmit it to the journal and then you argue possibly with the editor that it's now, we've done everything the referees asked for, please accept it now, or perhaps the editor will say, well, I need to send it back to the reviewers, they may still have some more comments and you have to go a second round. That's how peer review works. So the idea is that you get constructive feedback from the reviewers. In rare exceptions, you get very negative feedback because the reviewer really didn't like your work or really didn't like your supervisor. That happens too. Happened to me. I can tell you a little anecdote because that makes things more alive. I have a postdoc working with me in my group, and he had written a paper and sent it off to one of the regular journals in my field. And he got, and this was a follow-up study using computer simulations of an earlier paper that we had published, and that was based on astronomical observations. And the observations were challenged in the literature after our publication, and some people didn't believe our observations. But we now did the numerical simulation on the assumption that our observations were correct. Now we got referees' reports back on that submission, and the postdoc came to me and said, Richard, look at this. This is so negative. And the reviewers are only criticizing the previous paper, not my paper. So yeah, what do you do? I mean, this was, so I was a senior author, so it was up to me to think of a strategy how to move forward. And so I said, well, why don't you respond to the issues raised by the reviewers about your computer simulations, and I will respond to the attack on our previous work, because it does not belong in this paper. So hopefully, my response was sufficiently diplomatic. We actually explained some more in a confidential letter to the editor, that this will move forward, because for the postdoc it's important to have a peer-reviewed paper accepted. Yeah, so sometimes there are some unfortunate situations, but most of the time peer review is quite straightforward. You get comments, they are constructive, you respond to the comments, and you send it back. Peer review can be gamed, and we'll talk about that later as well. Right, so that's what I wanted to say about peer review. Here are some tips. Check the following. Does your journal offer timely yet comprehensive peer review? Do the reviewers provide thorough, valuable comments to help finalize your article? So that's the constructive feedback I was talking about. How many reviewers are used by the journal? That depends on the field and the journal. But in astrophysics, we tend to only use one reviewer. In biology, my wife is a biologist, they tend to use 3 to 5 reviewers. So you get, that also means that sometimes you get conflicting reports from different reviewers. And that's another aspect that you have to deal with, how to respond to conflicting suggestions. And the question, are the editors-in-chief, or is the editor-in-chief personally involved in the peer review process and the final decision? I would hope so, because editors-in-chief tend to be senior professors with a track record in the field, so I hope they're involved in the review process. So, I was talking about the speed of publication earlier, because sometimes, you know, you're at the end of your master's or PhD, you need that paper accepted before you can get your degree. So speed of publication is important. I know that in some fields, particularly in the humanities, it might take 2 years from the time of submission until you actually get something published. And that is, in my opinion, that's ridiculous. Because it doesn't take a reviewer 2 years to read the paper, okay? In my field, well, in the regular journals ask you to review an article within about 4 weeks or a month. Now, in reality, reviewers, this is my experience, reviewers will receive a reminder about a week before their review is due, and then they say, oh yeah, I should review that paper, let me do it now. So most of the reviews come in a day or two before the deadline, or on the deadline day. We've noticed that, because we've actually reduced the review time from 4 weeks to 3 weeks. And again, all of the reviews come in on the deadline day of 3 weeks. We did the same for our rapid publication journal. It used to be a 3-week turnaround for the referees. Now it's 10 days, and it works. People just submit on day 10. So this is psychology, I guess. This is quite funny. So it's important that you get a feeling for how long the process takes, particularly if you have a deadline to meet. A deadline to get your degree, a master or PhD, for instance, or a deadline for a funding agency, or a deadline to write a proposal, whatever. You can find that information. There are journal statistics on publication timeframes. Most or many articles list date received, date accepted, and date final submission received. That's usually on the byline at the top of your article.